this off the screen. This is the Capital Technology CapTech Talks from the Center for Women in Cyber. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and just happy to have you join us today. The talk that you'll be hearing today is by Dr. Mary Aiken, Melissa Martineau, and Dr. Erick Miyares, and it's Cyberpsychology Research at Capital Technology. We'll be looking at the latest research that Melissa and Erick have been doing as part of their doctoral studies. Here's the agenda that we'll be following today. We're going to go through the agenda pretty quickly so we can devote most of the time to the presentation. We'll hear a little bit about Capital. I'll have some housekeeping. I'll talk a little bit about this Center for Women in Cyber, who is the host for this session, about the presenters, and get right into the presentations. I'll have a few remarks toward the end of the time, and then right at the very end of the hour, we'll have a time for Q&A. Just very briefly, I know that many of you are quite familiar with Capital. We were established in 1927, which means we're coming up to our 100th anniversary. We're based in Laurel, Maryland. We're a private, nonprofit university devoted to STEM academic programs, awarding degrees all the way from the associate up to the doctoral level. And in fact, it is Erick and Melissa that are, Erick has already received his doctorate from Capital, and Melissa will soon have it. Housekeeping. We're going to answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation, but you can actually post them at any time in the text chat, and we'll circle back to answer as many as we can. I'm not activating microphones and webcams for participants in today's webinar. We're going to be sending you a link to the recording and to the slides, and it'll also be available on our webinar webpage. We offer participation certificates or attendance certificates, and I'll talk more about that toward the end of the hour. Let me talk just very, very briefly about the Center for Women in Cyber. And our chair of that center was not able to join us today, and so she asked me to just step into her place. This webinar and the next two, that is in October and November, are all part of the Center for Women in Cyber's Cyber Leadership Series. Capital Technology's Center for Women in Cyber is focused on empowering individuals of all ages to pursue careers in cyber. This center seeks to address the growing need for professionals and leaders in cyber-related fields. The CWC provides the resources, direction, and positive support needed for success in achieving professional and educational goals through presentations, hands-on activities, partnerships, this webinar series, and mentoring. The CWC is passionate in its quest to develop the next generation of diverse cyber leaders. With that, I want to go right into the presentation. We have three presenters today. We'll first lead off with Mary Aiken, who will be introducing our presenters. Let me show their pictures, and then we'll hear from Melissa Martineau and also Dr. Erick Miyares. With that, Mary, I'm going to give you control of the platform, and please proceed.
Thank you, Bill. So welcome to our CyberPsy research webinar. It's great to see a truly global audience logging in. My name is Professor Mary Aiken. I am chair and professor of the cyberpsychology department at CapTech University, Capital Technology University. We call it CapTech. And effectively, we launched, I believe it was 3 years ago, we first launched our cyberpsychology programs. So we have 4 programs. We have a Master of Research in Cyberpsychology, a Master of Research in Forensic Cyberpsychology, and then we have a Doctor of Philosophy, a PhD in Cyberpsychology, and then a PhD in Forensic Cyberpsychology, all available online. So anybody who's interested in getting a higher level degree in cyberpsychology, you should check out our programs. They're available on our website. So effectively, the purpose of today's webinar, a lot of people who are interested in completing doctoral or master's research in cyberpsychology often ask us, well, what's involved, or how do I pick my topic area? And The purpose of this new series of webinars, and we'll be doing one every year going forward, to actually showcase the research of our existing students. And I think that'll give everybody a really good chance to look at research that is under completion or that has been completed at CapTech. So as Bill says, we have two of our students. Well, Erick's no longer a student. He's completed his doctoral thesis. So we have one current and one who's just completed, who are going to talk to you today about the research. Feel free to jot down any questions, because we'll move to a Q&A at the end of this session. So what I'm going to do now is introduce our first speaker. It's Melissa Martineau. And Melissa is in the final stage of her PhD, which she is doing by publication. And she's been producing some really excellent work. And some of her papers have already been published, so you can check them out. We'll post some links to her work at the end of this, or when this webinar is actually circulated. Melissa is a cyber behavioral analyst. And the title of her PhD is Profiling Hackers, Establishing a Foundation for Cyber Behavioral Analysis. So Melissa's doctoral research focuses on the psychological and sociological correlates of hacking and cyber-dependent crime. The goal of her research is to increase knowledge in relation to the heterogeneous population and determine if it is possible to delineate between lawful and criminal hackers. Melissa says she was inspired to pursue her PhD in cyberpsychology based on the interesting work of Dr. Mary Aiken. Well, that is good to hear. And has based also her inspiration was based on the goodness of fit with the work that she does every day as a cyber behavioral analyst. The topic of her research, she says, is helping to inform her work in profiling cyber offenders. So I think it's really interesting for you to hear the inspiration of each candidate, because it'll help you either to decide to do a higher level degree, or for those who are already enrolled in our programs, to help refine your research areas. So I'm now going to pass over to Melissa, who's going to take you through her research.
And bear with us as we make this transition from my slide deck to hers. So I'm going to stop sharing, and she should be able to share now.
Perfect.
And there we go. Yes, we can see him now.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Mary. So as Mary indicated, my name is Melissa Martineau. I've been working in this field of cyber since 2019, and specifically as a cyber behavioral analyst since 2021. So essentially, the reason why I wanted to pursue a PhD in cyberpsychology comes down to the fact that it fit really well with my work, but also cybercrime right now is a top global threat. No matter where you are in the world, this is a crime type that is highly impactful, and the rates are increasing despite the rates decreasing in other types of traditional crime. A lot of the research that we have seen in this field, it's stemming from information systems technology, and there's a lot less research in the area of social science, although this is starting to change. And I truly believe that if we want to be effective in combating cybercrime, we need to not depend on traditional forms of law enforcement. We need to think outside the box, come up with new techniques, and we need to better understand the individuals who are committing these crimes. Because although AI has made considerable advancements in the last several years, so far computers are not attacking computers autonomously. There are still human actions being done in order to facilitate cybercrime. So the purpose of my study was really to take sort of an exploratory approach to look at what those psychological and sociological factors are that relate to hacking, to be able to establish the foundational knowledge that's absolutely necessary if we want to create these effective prevention and intervention strategies. My objectives were to figure out where we currently are in terms of establishing that foundational knowledge, to be able to identify the specific factors, so risk factors that come out of sociological, psychological, and motivational fields, to determine if we can figure out sort of that pathway to hacking. And then, of course, to also consider whether we can identify factors that will actually allow us to delineate these criminal hackers from their lawful counterparts, given the fact that really the population has a lot of similarities amongst them. So specifically, I wanted to answer the research questions of to what extent and what approaches of offender profiling have been applied to cybercrime at this time. I also wanted to know what the sociological and psychological factors that contribute to the pathway to criminal hacking, what those are, and how they interplay along the pathway to someone progressing along and becoming a serious cyber criminal. I also wanted to look at whether there is empirical support for the existing typologies that are out there regarding hackers. We do see a number of sort of different classification schemes out there that are trying to identify specific groups of hackers, but it's sort of unknown at this point as to whether these classification systems provide an accurate picture of the heterogeneous population of hackers that are out there. And then, of course, to identify those crucial factors that will help us identify what type of pathway a hacker is going to take, whether that be the criminal path or the lawful path. In determining what design I wanted to use for my research, I was very attracted to the dissertation by publication method, mainly because I felt like it would be an impactful way to share research broadly within the community, given the limited research that's currently in existence on this topic, and also because it allowed me to do this sort of sequential design in my research studies. So my first study was a systematic review of literature based on the PRISMA framework, and it was to establish what the current state of literature is in applying the behavioral analysis techniques specifically to cybercrime. There is sort of a limited body of research that is looking at this, so I decided to expand my sort of search for literature to include things that are congruent to profiling, such as motivations of cyber criminals, the characteristics of cyber criminals, and how they compare to their traditional crime counterparts. And then in the second study, I focused in on qualitative methods. So I did semi-structured interviews so that I could gather more in-depth information in relation to a small sample of current and former hackers. I really wanted to understand sort of the lived experiences of these offenders so that I would be able to identify potential factors that are crucial to that pathway to hacking. And this was a sequential design because of the fact that I used that data that emanated from the qualitative semi-structured interviews, and I used it to help inform, along with the existing research and literature, the different types of questions that I would include in an online survey, which became my third study. So in my third study, I created a bespoke survey for online access for hackers to be able to answer a whole series of questions, including a number of pre-existing scales, to determine whether the same sociological and psychological factors that I was seeing sort of evolve from the thematic analysis of the interviews were also being found to be correlated to hacking when I looked at a larger sample. I felt very strongly that the use of this sort of mixed method design would leverage the strength of both quantitative and qualitative methods, which I think can be really useful when you're looking at a field where, you know, it is fairly nascent in stage and you have a lot of questions that you're looking to answer. So my data collection process was an interesting one. Hackers are not the easiest population to access. They tend to be very security conscious and nervous individuals when it comes to answering questions of a random person who contacts them online. But certainly I was able to create personas online. I was very upfront about being a PhD student. I didn't pretend to be one of them. I went on to various hacker forums and different channels in Telegram and Discord, which are end-to-end encrypted communication platforms. And I posted very regular content for a number of months, which allowed me to build up a bit of credibility in those platforms and to start communicating with hackers so that when it was time to recruit for my research, I had some individuals who already sort of had an understanding of what I was doing and why I was asking them to participate in a research study. So the qualitative interviews was very much a convenient sample of identifying hackers one at a time and conducting interviews with them on the platform of their choice. And I allowed hackers to remain anonymous in their participation with me in terms of the interviews. Some chose to be sort of on video, and some chose to pursue the interview via text. And then I did the quantitative online survey. I used Simple Survey to host my survey. And I was able to use that platform to gather information from a much bigger sample of 105 hackers, so that I could identify the significant correlations and predictor variables for criminal hacking. The data analysis, as I mentioned, the first of the two sort of studies where I did my own data collection. Study 2, I did the thematic analysis as defined by Braun and Clark. And essentially, I took transcripts of each interview. I went through them very carefully, identifying themes and continuously just refining those themes and the different sort of variables that popped out to me to identify those sociological, psychological factors, the motivations, things that were potentially related to criminal hacking. And then in study 3, I did statistic analysis using IBM SPS version 29. And I combined both univariate analysis along with a multivariate analysis of binary regression analysis to be able to identify those factors that are correlated to criminal hacking, and that might help me predict or delineate between the criminal and the lawful hackers. So in terms of the findings, for my first question about the extent to which offender profiling is being applied to cybercrime, I learned that it's in a very early stage. We are able to do some deductive profiling, which means case-based, and you're profiling based on evidence in the specific case. However, we're not at a stage where we can really do inductive approaches, which are the more statistical approaches, probabilistic. Those you require robust data sets, and simply we do not have these robust data sets related to criminal hackers at this time. So essentially, my first study identified the fact that we really do need more primary empirical research in order to provide that strong foundation for behavioral analysis, and that we need not only the gray literature and the information system research that is out there, but we need much more social science-based research focusing specifically on cyber-dependent crime. In my second study, when I was interviewing the offenders, the former and current offenders, I was able to delineate a number of specific sort of points along the pathway to cybercrime, or different potential correlates to cybercrime. I say potential because it's a qualitative study. There were no statistical analyses done in this particular study. So I was able to support some previous findings of like an early interest in technology, significant amounts of time being spent online, usually in a situation where there was a lack of supervision by parents or guardians. I came to understand that these youth who didn't necessarily have a good experience in the physical world with friends and school were able to connect with like-minded youth online. So online essentially became a safe space for these young people, which helped them deal with problems in their real life, such as anxiety. Many of them talked to me about having generalized anxiety or social anxiety. They also had destabilizing childhood events. So destabilizing events, something you normally hear about in geopolitical research. I borrowed the term, but redefined it for the purpose of my research, in that destabilizing events in my research was any sort of situation or event in a young person's life that had the potential to impact their cognitive, physical, or social, psychological, or emotional well-being. And I allowed the respondents to define for themselves what they felt was a traumatic event in their childhood, rather than feeding them the specific examples that we often see in research around abuse and neglect and these types of issues. I also noticed that there was support for the idea that participation in online gaming is important in terms of these children's pathway. Specifically, modifying games was important. These individuals were participating in hacking forums and channels. They often had a very negative academic experience, whether that was not finding school to be intellectually stimulating, or whether it was from the perspective of being bullied or not well accepted within the environment. Some of them were experiencing psychological flow. So this feeling of sort of having a great deal of control and power over the process of hacking, and feeling like they were getting sort of positive feedback throughout the process, being able to shut out the rest of the world and just be sort of hyper-focused on the activity. There was a higher level of ADHD amongst many of these individuals. There was a low self-control, and a history of property offenses also came out as being important. When I looked at my final study, study 3, based on the 105 hackers from the hacking community, I was able to determine that there is not enough empirical evidence to suggest that the current hacker typologies are going to accurately represent the nuance within the hacker community. The current typologies simply lack the empirical evidence, specifically those ones that are bivariate in nature. A lot of the existing typologies are focused on 2 different variables: technical skill and sophistication, and motivation. However, when you actually look at these types of factors, there's no consistent correlation between these 2 variables. So you can't really marry a specific motivation with a specific skill level among hackers. When I looked at whether it was possible to identify the factors that could differentiate the criminal from lawful hackers in study 3, I came to realize that there are truly more similarities than differences between lawful and criminal hackers, particularly early on in the pathway to hacking behavior. They tend to have a lot of commonalities, such as that early interest in technology, being online quite frequently, maybe not having a lot of supervision, having even experienced certain sort of adverse events in their youth. However, there are a number of factors that came out of the regression analysis that were able to predict 86.5% of the cases of criminal hackers. And that specifically was if they had a history of property offending, if they were modifying game code or security protections. And this goes beyond simply using game cheats or benefiting from the modification of game code that someone else modified. It had to be the individual who could have the skill level to modify the code themselves or modify the security protections themselves. And then also exhibiting low self-control. So these were the three factors that work together to help predict who would become a lawful hacker versus who would be a criminal hacker. So overall, the research was very telling. I found it incredibly interesting. I really enjoyed having discussions with these various hackers who trusted me to participate in my research. Very grateful to them. Some of my overarching conclusions are that the hacker community is truly very heterogeneous. It's not one set or type of person who is committing cyber-dependent crime. It is potentially possible to delineate criminal and lawful hackers based on the criminal history, the low self-control, and the history of hacking video games. I also further delineated my hacker samples based on the specific hacking activities that they were carrying out. So this allowed me to look at three different groupings of criminal hackers. The first was the virus or malware writer. And this group, they tended to be the more technologically advanced offenders, and they specialized in cybercrime, which meant that they were much less likely to have that history of traditional crime. The next group was the distribution or users of existing malware. So these were hackers who were taking advantage of things like cybercrime as a service platforms and leveraging them to commit cyber offenses. And these individuals tend to be hackers with a lower educational attainment. They had more diverse criminal profiles, including a history of property offenses, and they were more likely to indicate that they had experienced depression. And then finally, the most serious criminal hackers, who I called the serious cyber criminals, these are the folks who are doing things like distributed denial of service attacks, leveraging botnets, and committing ransomware attacks. And these were sort of the most deviant hackers who had problematic histories past in school. They had history of violent offending, and they were more likely to indicate a motivation of this need for power and control. So at the end of the day, the findings of this research are, still you have to use caution in terms of using them to inform deductive cyber behavioral analysis. Definitely need for replication studies to see how these factors hold out when they are applied again amongst different samples. But certainly my recommendation would be that practitioners should avoid using the sort of bivariate hacker typologies that are based on motivation and technical sophistication to inform any type of behavioral assessment. Quickly now, limitations of the research. Of course, there's always going to be limitations to your research studies. Convenient sampling means that it limits the generalizability of my findings. However, with such a difficult to reach population, it becomes very important to, try and get anyone you can to answer these questions. So the convenient sampling became a bit of a necessity. In my research, anonymity was prioritized over verifying that a participant didn't answer my survey more than once. So therefore, it is possible that offenders, criminal hackers were answering multiple times. I did use some techniques to go through my survey data to make sure that, it was as clean and as accurate as possible. Self-report, of course, is susceptible to bias and dishonesty. The anonymity, however, was a mechanism by which to try to limit the amount of dishonesty, because people are less likely to brag when you don't even know who they are. So that was something that I tried to leverage. While 105 is a pretty good size sample, it quite simply is not robust enough to permit some more sort of significant statistical analyses, particularly when you start trying to stratify the sample into smaller groups. There was only a very small number of female participants. They're very hard to recruit, and actually efforts I made to recruit them in the forums had me being accused of trying to get a date. So that didn't go over very well, but I did get a few female participants. And participants were predominantly from North America or Western Europe, probably a factor also of the fact that my research was conducted in the English language only. So in terms of recommendations for future research, I think it's going to be very important moving forward that future research in social science adopt this standard taxonomy, making very clear distinctions between the cyber-dependent offenders and cyber-enabled offenders, because these are really often not the same individuals who are committing these two different types of offending. It's possible they are, but we need to be aware that there could be interesting distinctions between these individuals. We need replication studies with novel samples, particularly geographically diverse samples, so that we understand the differences between hackers in non-English speaking countries, in countries where cybercrime is more accepted, etc. I think longitudinal studies will also give us a lot better insight into the initiation into hacking, the continuation on the pathway, and what ultimately causes people to desist in their hacking behaviors. So I think that there's a lot of work that could be done to give us this kind of insight among the same individual, but without having to do that retrospectively. And then also any research on the cyber underground would be really important, as this is a really important enabler for cybercrime. And evaluating those programs in prevention and intervention that we currently have to see how effective they are and who they're most effective for, so that we can continue to improve and try to not criminalize youth who find themselves on a pathway, sometimes unwittingly, really. So that's it for my presentation. I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to speak here today, and I welcome any questions that anyone may have later in the program.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, we'll do questions later once Erick's done his presentation. So first of all, congratulations. Excellent research, very elegant research design. And also, congratulations for getting 105 hackers in your in your survey. That's quite an achievement. I was involved in research a couple of years ago, and we struggled to get 5. So that was, and they were an incarcerated population. We struggled to actually get the prison interviews. I think that everybody should read Melissa's paper, her systematic review of the cyber profiling literature. I believe in time this will become a landmark paper. It's an absolutely comprehensive and excellent piece of work. Personally, I've published in the area of youth pathways into cybercrime a decade ago. I'm very interested in that journey from tech-talented youth into juvenile cyber delinquency, into lone cyber criminal, and potentially into being recruited into organized crime. And I can see some of the questions are touching on that, on the difference between lone criminal hacking and organized cyber criminal hacking. So we'll come back to that. Also, when you say SPSS version 29, that takes me back. There's something very aging about realizing that SPS was in single digits when I completed my research. So there you go. All right, let's move on to Erick. So we have Erick Miyares here. Erick has recently completed his doctoral thesis defense. So congratulations, Dr. Miyares. Well done. Erick's job title, he's a senior threat advisor and cyber behavioral scientist supporting insider threat mission. His PhD title is Operational Cyberpsychology, Support to Cyberspace Operations. Erick's doctoral research is the first empirical investigation into the lived experiences of elite military interactive operators, a really, really important and indeed niche area of research, but incredibly important. It explores the unique psychological and cognitive stressors of their role, introducing and providing the initial validation for 2 constructs: cyberspace operator syndrome, which details the cumulative occupational toll, and cognitive cyber presence, the state of deep immersion required for mission success. I asked both Melissa and Erick to set out on their inspiration for completing their doctoral research. And Erick, if I may, I will take a minute to read your written inspiration because I actually find it very moving and very important. So Erick said, my inspiration has always been a core belief from my career in special operations that the human is more important than the hardware. That personal belief has become a deeply personal mission a few years before I retired, when I lost two of my teammates to suicide just 1 month apart. It was a pivotal moment for me. I realized that I had to focus on the human factor to truly understand the challenges operators face. When I started my initial research, it became clear that so much conflict happens entirely within the operator's mind. Reading foundational work like Prof. Aiken's book, The Cyber Effect, and Dr. Suler's research was key. It helped me understand that cyberpsychology was the essential lens for exploring these high cognitive job roles, which are fundamentally different from warfare in the physical world. It solidified my decision to choose this specific topic to fill the gap in our understanding, give this community a language to describe their unique experience, and build a foundation for the support they deserve. That's incredibly inspirational, Erick, to read what inspired you to complete this work. And with that, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Aikens. Let me pull up my slides before anything. I'm assuming everybody can see the slides.
Yes,
We can, Erick, but if you can go ahead and put them into display mode or screen mode. Slideshow mode, I guess you'd say.
How about that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Once again, Professor Mary Aikens, thank you so much, and CapTech for the opportunity to discuss my research. Obviously, from the intro, is extremely personal, and actually, I haven't even looked back on sort of that statement since I first applied to Capital Technology University about 3 years ago. Interestingly, Melissa was actually on the same phone call with me when we sort of interviewed with Professor Aikens about our journey and what we expected and what we wanted to get out of sort of this, our PhDs into cyberpsychology. So it kind of brings back some memories and some emotions. So thank you for the intro, and Melissa, it was just wonderful to hear your research. And for you in the audience, you'll hear, and I'll try to bring up, we're actually together as two students that started the journey together. We worked together behind the scenes. Obviously, we're geographically separated, but online we were able to kind of work our research together for these kind of last 3 years, as there is a link between Melissa's research into hackers and into mine. And so I'll start. This is the slide deck that I use for my defense, so I may bring some emotions when I go through it again, but I wanted to be able to share. It's a bit modified of what my research entailed, but without actually having access to the full dissertation that ended up being several hundred pages. There's a bits and pieces that I'll try to add in there for context. So again, the scope is operational cyberpsychology to support to cyberspace operations. And I'll start from the beginning just to say there's very little research in leveraging cyberpsychology in support of national security. So I'll frame that this essentially is about the human, but it's within the construct of military, Department of Defense, if you would, cyberspace operations. So I'll do my best here to explain within these next 19 minutes. Okay, so the statement of the problem, essentially, Professor Aikens kind of explained it. Core to my research was a unique population that works for the Department of Defense or the intelligence community, and they're called interactive operators. And you can see them as essentially elite cyber operators that were recruited, assessed, selected, and recruited and trained to conduct unique cyberspace operations in support of national security. The reason I chose this is just to be told I was a previous operator during my tenure. And so I understood the struggles that went with this type of work. And as Professor Aiken's kind of mentioned, there were 2 suicides that were disruptive in my life as I prepared to actually retire from the military. And long story short, an aspect of retiring from the military was just not the physical, for example, the traumatic brain injuries or post-traumatic stress, musculoskeletal pains, and everything else that goes with service in the military. But there was this lingering sort of a cognitive decline and sort of some moral dilemmas that I had not processed, and that I figured that potentially many of those that I had worked with closely and many that we had heard in our careers that had unfortunately died by suicide may have been some ties to some of the hardships of their work. And in particular, the problem here is attempting to understand, I believe, one of the few unique occupations in the military that is predominantly in cyberspace. It is not generally in the physical world as we're used to infantrymen, pilots, scuba divers, or anybody else. This is solely in cyberspace, obviously. But then throughout this research, understanding that it is psychological, and this is where the beauty, if you would, of looking at it through the lens of cyberpsychology. So essentially, this is what I wanted to understand is, what is the work that these operators do when essentially they go into the matrix, right? Okay, so the rationale, these were compiled just to be able to get at the multitude of different things that went along with some of the adverse impacts, if you would, or the understanding of what it actually means to be an interactive operator or the teams that operate such. And so the first one for my priority, and that's so what, again, this is a doctoral study. I was fortunate that the last 2 years were funded by the Army Research Office, but that was through a fellowship. And so tying this back to sort of a so what, it ties back to our National Defense Authorization Act, which of 2024, that essentially wanted the Cyber Mission Force to enhance their occupational resiliency. For obvious reasons, we're losing this unique population for a multitude of reasons, but they're experiencing hardships while they're in service, which is impacting their role. And then unfortunately afterwards, when they transition out of the Department of Defense or the intelligence community, then there's a myriad of issues that yet our veterans administrations and our hospitals are not aware of how to deal with this unique population. And then ultimately, there's a gap in understanding this psychological framework, right? Not only the typical symptoms of the models that we use for service members to identify burnout, post-traumatic stress, TBI, or anything else. There wasn't these quite models of understanding the impact of their role. And I'll cover some of this some more here in a minute. And I really wanted to, and this came afterwards, this came after almost 2 years of all the research and doing some initial conversations with friends and others that I would then end up recruiting for the study, and sort of just kind of understanding that their voices weren't heard, right? And that was important. It was important for them to understand, as similar to Melissa, when trying to recruit hackers, there's the so what factor. Why am I going to share all of these things with you, and what do I get out of it? Because you're just a PhD student. What can you actually impact? And so I wanted to be able to capture this towards the end as sort of their lived experience. And the model for this, and I'll cover it again, it's called Operator Syndrome by a friend, Dr. Chris Free, who actually ended up being on my committee. And Operator Syndrome is essentially, it's a framework where those in special operations from anywhere can look at a list of things how you will be impacted with your life in this role, and be able to say, yes, I have 13 of these or 10 of these things, and now I have a get well plan. But till you have an understanding of what the impacts of your role are going to be, then you're kind of just lost. And then what you'll then see is that these operators can have difficulties just acknowledging, and even the services acknowledging, on some of the issues that arise from this type of work. And so I'm going to go ahead and speed through these till we get some of the key points. And so for the literature review, actually started right before I applied. So there's reference here to a Chappelle. It's an Air Force document that he did in 2013, and it was mixed between what the Air Force then called remote warriors. And this actual document, besides also reading Professor Aiken's book on cyber effects and Dr. Soller's work, it was the first study that I had read that actually then documented in this group called Remote Warriors that included drone operators. Many of you are familiar with the issues that we have had in time with our drone operators, essentially killing from afar. And in this study, they actually then were able to document. It included drone operators, but also cyber operators, and it started to chip at sort of the burnout, the psychological impacts, the capturing some of the moral injuries. But it didn't quite capture what, as an operator myself, I wanted to be able to say, well, what's wrong with me? Why are we dealing with this? And so the literature review started early on before. And it was just a wonderful process to be able to dive into aspects of military research, cyber psychology, standard psychology, neuropsychology, cybersecurity. A lot of rabbit holes, but luckily I had some great mentors that kind of put me back on focus. So some things that the literature review at the end ended up finding out, which is ultimately what created the constructs later on in the study for what we then term cyberspace operator syndrome. Is again, there was an identified gap, and I was able to start working towards this framework that had a goal to attempt to see if I can create a similar one as operator syndrome. Most of the research focused on hackers. It focused on defensive operators, but very few of the research actually focused on those that conducted offensive cyberspace operations more, and for several reasons, not only to some of the sensitivities, but just that population wasn't really studied openly. And then there was no validated frameworks, right? Again, when I looked at all the other work that I had done in the military or from the research, we can always tie back to frameworks that supported the physiological aspects of pilots. We understood what it is to develop and create and sustain scuba divers that went underwater. Obviously, the different domains. We understood what it is to develop and maintain infantry men in sort of in kinetic warfare, but we had really little frameworks to understand from a cyberspace operators. So the purpose again was to answer 5 research questions because there was no standing document that said, here's what we need to know. So I had to kind of create this in working with my committee on what the study was going to focus on, and ultimately was understand what is it that cyberspace operators do from the actual actions when they touch the keyboard and they look into the screen and they actually immerse into cyberspace. What is that? And then what are the residues? What is the cognitive and psychological aspects of doing that role? So here's a research question. So the first 3 is what I first started with, and then I was just very fortunate that throughout the research process, kind of had those aha moments and then developed 2 other ones. So the first one is, how do psychological and cognitive factors influence the performance and effectiveness of interactive operators? The second was, what specific challenges and stressors do these operators encounter? What strategies or interventions effectively mitigate these challenges? And the third, how can cognitive and psychological factors be optimized to enhance the performance and well-being of interactive operators? And again, this comes from my unique lens of serving in the military, where we always identify a problem and then we're trying to identify a solution. So my research questions were generally formed with sort of that perspective. And then ultimately, as I continue to do the research, and I'm fortunate to have some of the subject matter experts from within these fields serve onto my committee. I had a senior interactive operator, which was a mentor of mine and actually pushed me towards a PhD. He was part of my committee. I had Dr. Chris Free. I had Dr. Spellietta that had actually written some of the early on document on operational cyberpsychology. Adopting a special operations framework was critical. And with that, then I wanted to understand, okay, let me try to create, is there grounds for a cyberspace operator syndrome? That would become my 4th. And then the 5th one again was, well, what is it that we do? What is it that the hacker, for lack of better words, or the interactive operator, once we engage with the keyboard, the mouse, and the screen, what does that mean? How does that end up factoring into that report from 2013 when you have interactive operators discussing about emotional tolls and potential post-traumatic stress and suicide ideation? But I wanted to understand the why. What is it that they did and how were they impacted? And so the methodology, just to keep this kind of simple, is a modified mixed methods explanatory sequential design. So blah. That really meant that my initial conversation with Professor Atkins was, hey, let's try this approach. Let's try to talk to this community of individuals, because it would be the least obtrusive, understanding that it was going to be very, very difficult to try to get 25, 50, or 100 interactive operators either currently serving, which there are concerns with that, with the Department of Defense, asking as a student to have these individuals participate in a non-governmental study, or secondly, then anybody that's left the military and sort of find these individuals and sort of find a way to have them. So we were trying to look at, hey, do we engage in conversations, or would we try to do it quantitatively and have a bunch of questions? Well, what would these questions end up being? Ultimately ended up with a mixed method, which ultimately was the best thing that I did as far as setting up this study. And we will discuss some of the results here shortly. So here's the data collection. Again, this just for notion, the data collection of the instruments took about 1 year to put together. The biggest factor was just understanding that there was so much to ask, right? So that was on me, learning as a PhD student, that I had to have a scope of what I was going to ask. But at the same time, understanding that as I developed a relationship with individuals that were looking forward to taking the study, that I would only probably get one opportunity right now to do it right. So long story short, it ended up being a 24-section mixed method online survey, which I'll discuss here in a little bit. There was two key parts to it. The first one was the participant qualification questionnaire. I had to first ensure for the study that they in fact were qualified individuals. However, I had to be careful not to ask them for their credentials or anything that would then get into sensitive data. So this was this first questionnaire was to ensure that they met the requirement. And just to kind of lay a little bit of the difficulties behind this, these are all the interactive operators that came from 5 different military services, and some of them came from the intelligence community. So trying to protect those specifics, but also understanding that not all of them are created the same. And the span of the study would be 20 years. So roughly around 1995 to about 2023, which the population. So I had different types of certified interactive operators. So the study had to be flexible for that. And within a variety of different qualifications and experiences that they all had. I didn't want to limit, but I had to make sure that at a minimum, they had enough experience, a minimum of a year experience, and had been engaged in some form of certified survey without me having to call supervisors or look at records. Ultimately, the main study ended up being 382 questions. I think if Professor Aiken had known that number prior, she may have kind of given me the hook. But fortunately, this study, based on literature review and reviewing other studies, we were able to actually bring in, for example, the dark tetrad, looking at the darker personalities. I brought in online disinhibition, which are from cyberpsychology. I brought in modified burnouts and a bunch of other different scales that I developed in order to be able to try to answer these research questions and better understand who the operator is and what is it that the operator does. Okay, so data collection, here's the general parts or sections of the qualification. It's who are they, what are their personal informations, their background. Many of these either served as military, then went civilian, or went government, or went contractor. So it was a lot of data, a lot of different variables that throughout the year of putting this together and the 6 months of having the study became evident that these are humans and they go everywhere. And that was extra data that I had to track. And so here's the main survey. This took a long time to put together. This was modified several times, but ultimately it ended up becoming based on the pilot study that I did. I got some feedback. And so these are the key sections. I wanted to understand their professional identities and their perceptions of role. In particular, did they see themselves as cyber warriors? Did they see themselves as remote warriors, interactive operators, or hackers? Because when we start dealing with the psychological impacts or the burnout, there were some aspects of it. Hey, I left the military and I'm no longer an interactive operator, and that was part of my identity. So I had to understand their identity. And sort of as Melissa spoke, she talked about hacker identity. That was key because many of us, I knew I was a young kid hacker when I grew up, wasn't very malicious, but I loved to take things apart. But I had to make sure that my data reflected on not only what I viewed as the characteristics that I had of why I wanted to do this job, but others. And long story short, it was very key in that many of them saw themselves in one form or the other as a hacker. Online behavior and disinhibition, again, cyberpsychology, video gaming. I wanted to know what motivated them and rewarded them. And then a lot of these other ones, I won't cover all of them, is actually asking about how their interactions with certain parts of their job role impacted them psychologically, emotionally, and cognitively. And so that was the big thrust of the study, was to understand in the functions that they did as cyber operators, what caused them the stress, what caused them sort of rumination and other things. And then I wanted to ask very carefully about their experiences in their organizations. Did they get the psychological support that they needed? Were they able to talk about, essentially from the literature review and from other data, that there was potential for ethical and moral dilemmas? And I'll cover some of that here in a bit, but there was a lot of parts to this study. Okay, data analysis, very similar to what Melissa did. We used sort of the same tools. I focused more on very simply looking at the data for sort of the descriptive statistics, because that's all that time allotted for within this scope, within this study. There is still much more data that I can analyze post this. And the key of it actually surprisingly came from the qualitative analysis, what the operators actually said. And just in short, some of it is very emotional. I had days that I had to walk away from reading what they were put because it was very strong. The study in itself there was anonymity behind it, so I didn't know who they were and what the responses were. I know who took it, but I don't know the responses. And then it was also funny, some of the things that they said, because they had humor, but underlining is a lot of them really wanted to share some of these things that impacted their lives. Okay, so let's get to the findings really quick. So obviously, the study validated cyberspace operator syndrome from the variety of the questions, very similar to what Dr. Freed did for special operations for operator syndrome. Cyberspace operator syndrome has been validated, at least from within the study. One of the key things that came out of it, because within all the other official, was always looking at burnout, right? Like burnout, our operators are getting burnt out, but we don't quite, we understand it is from their work. Maybe they're not being appreciated, but we weren't understanding the burnout from the actual job. An interesting factor that came out of this was many of these individuals are highly motivated, got in country, they love the challenge, they want to succeed in the mission. But at the same time, there's a high rate of burnout within what they do. And some of this is attributed to the limitations of our tools and how that individual actually connects to cyberspace and their ability to almost, if you would, please enter into the matrix, route their way through the internet and get into an adversarial building and almost in their minds completely imagine what that building looks like, all the way down to a server, an access point, with the strategic goal of finding an individual or data that needs to be found. So it's very high cognitive of a function, but that can cause burnout. So at the same time that they reported high levels of burnout, they continue to be highly motivated in this line of work. And so ultimately, the three factors were cognitive, is a high vigilant strain, they're impaired executive functioning, and it's just constant engagement using their minds, right, for this level of activities. Psychological, just in short, there are things that they saw and they had to do that challenged them. At times, offensive cyber operations compared to sort of more known of the espionage side of cyber operations, they potentially hit that enter button and something kinetically, maybe something went boom or something was destroyed at the other end. And that can take a toll on individuals. Or unfortunately, many of them in certain times in cyberspace operations had to go to a foreign computer and pull back beheading videos or pictures and videos of child sexual abuse material. And this population isn't necessarily screened and assessed, and nor has the psychological support mechanisms easily to help them get through sort of these activities. And then lastly, physiologically, right? Spending 8, 12 hours on constant shifts on this type of work does take a physiological toll. And all of this was derived from the study. So number two, the large finding is cognitive cyber presence. So essentially, I wanted to understand what it is that operators did and came up with the concept of cognitive cyber presence. And essentially, there's 4 key components, and that's flow, immersion, presence, and extended mind theory. And so for time, I won't get into them, but ultimately that is the formula to understand the components that are needed in order to be able to be sufficient or be key in this type of work. But it's a double-edged sword. So the better operator can get into this cognitive cyber presence, there are also things that can disrupt it and had some adverse impacts. Okay, so contribution to the body of knowledge. Interestingly, as of last week, I was actually fortunate to attempt to make my way to the Pentagon. Hopefully I can finish this next week to actually brief these findings. So this will give back, hopefully, to the cyber workforce some of these findings. But in addition, I'm going to, the dissertation is turn these into papers here soon. So hopefully that continues to provide. So in conclusion, these interactive operators, a couple of things. They follow the very similar Hackle ethos. They're curious. They do this for God and country, but a lot of them is the challenge, the wanting to figure out how it works, the constantly wanting to learn more and understand. And so that's a very delicate balance. And as of recent, because of the demand, if you would, for cyberspace operations, cyber warfare, we have this uniqueness of where these individuals, again, come from this hacker sort of inquisitive technical mind background, but they're also kind of thrown into this warfighter community. So this is this interesting world that needs to be worked through at that level. Ultimately, again, the cognitive immersion was proven, as well as cyberspace operators. Let me go to the next slide. So some recommendations is we've got to do more work. And I'll say that I've been pleasantly surprised that from at least the Department of Defense and certain, they're interested in understanding this research. And many of the individuals that were in the study are actually, in one form or other, able to actually move forward some of this research. Based on some of the literature, it is, hey, we also have to see if we can use and understand some biometric data so we can better understand the physiological responses. But at the same time, let's try to find a way that when these individuals are hitting this high cognitive load, when they're starting to strain or have emotional tolls in what they're doing, the ultimate goal is really not to reduce failure. Once we hit that enter button, it's really hard to take that command back. And so we're trying to ensure we can optimize not only the operator, but in the way that they work to reduce negative impacts, but make them much more effective. I think that's all I have for time, and I'll turn this back. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was amazing. I think you got into a state of flow there. we've gone a few minutes over, but that's fine. We're going to do some Q&A now. But first of all, I want to say congratulations, Eric, on your research. you're right, as your survey got longer and longer, and as more and more scales were added, I thought, how are participants ever going to complete this? But like, you did extremely well to get that done. And just another point is that your research is so important in terms of how it can actually help people who are active in the field. And I think that's incredibly important. And additionally, I want to say a personal congratulations to you. Very proud of Melissa's achievements, but very proud of your achievements, particularly considering, and you just mentioned it, that you suffered from a traumatic brain injury, TBI, and PTSD. So for anybody who's logged in listening to us now, or for anybody who listens to this webinar after the fact, there is absolutely no excuse why you can't complete a higher level degree if Erick can do it, considering everything he's been through. So congratulations once again. Okay, I'm going to